Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Carol Burke is a folklorist and a professor of English here at UCI. After starting a career at the U.S. Naval Academy, Professor Burke taught at Johns Hopkins University and Vanderbilt before arriving here in 2003. Despite landing in suburban Irvine, Professor Burke's passion for understanding and documenting folklore has taken her across the world. She recently returned from a research trip to India, and she is embedded with American military units throughout Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 2 decades. Professor Burke has written about her experiences and insights about a range of topics, from military culture to accounts of the uncanny exchanged by women in prison, through academic and popular press publications. Yet, in a brief conversation we had the other week, I found out that Professor Burke is passionate about storytelling through other mediums as well. She told us that, having made all of her own clothes as a child, she believes she would be a costume designer if she wasn't a professor and writer. Professor Burke also mentioned something in passing that felt profound to me, especially having been a part of this series for some time now. She said that storytelling is a collaborative enterprise and that being an audience is one of the most important gifts that you can give someone. I hadn't thought about being a part of an audience in this way before, and I hope that our presence is as much of a gift as Professor Burke believes it to be, for I anticipate her storytelling will be a gift to all of us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carol Burke.
Thanks for being here. Friends, strangers, I really appreciate it. And when I was asked to be part of this series, What Matters to Me and Why, initially I was really thrilled. And I knew immediately that what I wanted to talk about was the told story, the personal narrative, a genre that I've spent all of my adult life collecting. But when I started to think about, okay, how can I put together a talk that marries the professional with the personal, I suddenly became intimidated. And the kind of questions I was asking myself were things like, could I really communicate how much I loved the stories that midwestern farm families told me, that incarcerated women told me over a 3-year period, that I did field work in women's prisons, and that members of the armed services shared with me. And how could I communicate the fact that the stories that friends and strangers continue to tell me about their lives enrich me and will until the day I die, no doubt. But let me begin with a little background, and it's the kind of background that I would try to collect from anybody I interviewed. I'll tell you some stories that are my stories, and I'll tell you stories of others. I grew up in one of 100 villages in an area about a third of upstate New York, in an area called the Adirondack State Park, a forest preserve. And it's a big place, 600 million acres, 3,000 lakes, and it was the place, it was designated by the state of New York at the end of the 19th century. It was the hunting ground, and my village was right there in the hunting ground of Teddy Roosevelt. It was the summer haven for the rich, the Huntingtons, the Vanderbilts, the Roosevelts, all built large camps on lakes in this state park. But even though it had that, and it was also a vacation area and a beautiful place, it also is a park that has allowed controlled logging and also mining. And mining over the years has included things like iron ore, granite, talc, garnets, which are used for sandpaper, And in my village, a mining village owned exclusively by a mining company, titanium. My father, a pipe fitter at the mine, was killed when he was 35 years old in a mining accident. I was a year and a half, my sister was 7. And our mother, a teacher at the local elementary school, was allowed to stay on and continue to rent our company-owned apartment because they needed teachers. We were the only family in this little village of less than 1,000 that didn't have a mine employee in our family. And we lived in this place. It was, in some ways, thriving. But almost every weekend, and for longer stays during the summer, we would come down out of the mountains to a place that my mother called down home. And that was in the fertile St. Lawrence River Valley, where my mother and father had grown up on neighboring farms, and we'd go back there, staying not with her family, but with my father's family, my grandmother. This was a big Irish Catholic family with lots of storytellers. And I remember as a kid climbing into a big overstuffed rocker with my grandmother, asking her once again to tell me the same story she told me many, many times that her Irish grandmother had told her. Stories that no matter how much I heard them, I never tired of. And when in the evenings, when the dishes were done and an aunt and uncle would come over for an evening of pinochle, the stories would start again. Or after Mass every Sunday, when all of my extended family would gather there for coffee and donuts, there would be more stories. And what I particularly delighted in were the stories that my father's brothers and sister told about growing up with him. And it was their memories, because I had none of my own, that gave definition to the character whom they recalled and whom I imagined. And it filled some of the void that his death had left in our family. These were stories of a kid who was a cut-up, a practical joker, the young man who was as generous, my uncle used to say, as the day is long. Someone who himself was a master storyteller. And there were even these meta stories about my father's ability to tell stories. One uncle told that after World War II, and they'd returned to upstate New York, they were both working, my father and his brother were working on a construction crew that was building the St. Lawrence Seaway from the Atlantic into the Great Lakes. And there were these deep, deep trenches, and my uncle told about my father as this storyteller. He said, if the foreman or the engineer came to check on our progress in the deep trenches, laying the footings of the locks, he'd listen for your dad's voice, because Ray was always entertaining us with his stories. Help the work go faster. Like most World War II vets, my father didn't tell stories about war experiences. From my mother's recollections, letters and documents, I pieced together details from that small part of his very short life. After my mother's death a few years ago, I was going through some of her papers, and I found this worn wallet, in which was an even more worn letter addressed to Sergeant Burke, a letter thanking him for saving the writer's life. But as dear as this letter must have been to my father, I also knew that it couldn't balance the survivor's guilt he carried back from the war, guilt over those whose lives he was not able to save in the fierce fighting that took place in France as it was liberated at the end of the war. You might think that a child growing up in a mining village would be an existence plagued with grimness, with poverty and depression, but it wasn't. My mother was happy to be living in a village that had warmly embraced her and her 2 young children after my father's death. Nestled at the foot of the tallest mountain in the Adirondacks, so the story goes, our village carried the Algonquin name of the mountain, Tahawus, which translated as cloud splitter. When we weren't hanging out at the Tahawus Y, we kids wandered off into the wilderness. It was a wilderness we knew so well we never got lost in. In the summer, as soon as we could swim, we'd hop on our bikes and head to a place we called Big Rock, big long ledge going down into the Hudson with deep water underneath. So at 8 or 9, we just, when it was warm weather, we were hot, we had nothing to do, we'd pack a lunch, go up there and spend the day jumping off the ledge into the cold upper Hudson. There were no lifeguards, no parents to ensure our safety. We were free to fish in moving streams and free in the winter to hike into the woods and go to the toboggan trail. And the toboggan trail was a run that was so long and so steep, it would go from one side of the village around all the way to the other side. And as long as we came back by dark, our parents let us do what we wanted to do. They knew what we knew, which was that if we ever got in any trouble, all we had to do or to send somebody to do was knock on a door, and somebody who either knew us or knew our parents, everybody knew everybody else in this community, kind of like Uni Hills, they would come to our rescue. Life in this company town of young families was strangely idyllic. The rent was next to nothing, the utilities all included, a strong union, United Auto Workers at the time, guaranteed the miners high wages, and my father's death had ushered in a new safety program that ensured that no other workers would die on the job. My mother was a well-respected teacher. There were stories, of course, that challenged the innocent vision I've painted here for you. Stories of the young couples so bored with their lives in this remote mountain village that they formed a swingers club. And you can imagine how difficult that was to keep quiet in this small village. Stories about a miner's wife who, after a long, cold winter, had it and climbed to the top of the tailings pile, dangerous construction of cob rock, and this was the size of a small mountain. And she climbed to the top and refused to come down. There were stories of a priest who showed up at every junior prom to take notes on the prom gowns worn by the high school girls. Gowns that dipped either too low in the front or too low in the back, or that merely had exposed shoulders and arms. And this would be fodder for his sermons for the weeks to come. And he'd go on and on about them. When the approach of summer came, he'd call any pair of shorts we girls wore immodest if they didn't come down to the knees. And he would instruct the women of the community that they had to sew extra cuffs on them to make them come down to the knees. And I asked my mother once, do we really have to do this? And she said, no, I'm not going to be bothered with that, fortunately. But you could tell the most devout in the village because their children had one color of short down to the mid-thigh and another color down to the knees. His female clothing modifications went a little too far, though, when he distributed sewing directions, complete with diagrams, so that the women in the Altar Rosary Society could transform their pointy bras, fashionable at the time, into flat ones. This was the last straw for some parishioners. And one weekend, a delegation made the 3-hour trip to Ogdensburg, New York, to the bishop and handed him the diagram of the pointy bra modification. Fortunately for us, the priest was ordered to leave. Sadly, for another congregation, they had to live with our cast-off. When I left this remote area, 50 miles from what anything you'd call a supermarket, 70 miles to the nearest hospital, still the same today, I'll tell you, and went off to college, my interest changed from the told story to the written story. A pre-med major in chemistry, I took every English course I could fit in. The heavy reading load in English courses was not easy for me. You see, I have a learning disability. I'm dyslexic. So it would take me longer to read a novel than it would take most of you. But I persevered, and in my junior year, switched my major to what I most loved, literature. And upon graduation, went on to Cornell to get an MFA in creative writing. But I soon learned that an MFA and a published book of poems does not a job guarantee. So before going back to graduate school for my Ph.D., I taught, like a lot of writers, part-time teaching writing at universities and colleges, and did stints in a program that a lot of young writers did at the time, a program from the National Endowment for the Arts called Writers in the Schools. And what we did was, we'd do 3-week or 6-week gigs in either an elementary, middle school, or high school, 3 classes a day and a teacher workshop at the end of the day. I quickly discovered in this that the key to having a good class was being with a teacher who really wanted you to be there. And so every time I would go to one of these schools and the principal would say, what classes do you want to be with, what age group? I assume it's seniors and juniors, and I'd say, no, just give me the teachers. I'll teach a writing workshop and a shop class if the shop teacher wants me to be there. None ever took me up on that, I'll tell you, but several special ed teachers did. They had small classes and they could easily integrate me in. And it turned out that I loved these courses more than, these classes more than even the others. And what I found were groups of children who often couldn't write their stories down, but in many ways compensated with their telling ability and could tell these elaborate accounts with lots of detail. To give you an idea, here's what 7-year-old David from Kentland, Indiana, told me when we came back. It was the first day after vacation, and I said, "What did you do on your vacation?" And this is what he said, and I would take these down verbatim. "I never did a thing. The only thing I did was sit at home. Once I went down to my friends and played up in his storeroom. We played with a KW semi that let smoke out of it. Most of the semis are twin screws with 2 back axles. We had a twin screw at the junkyard. We used to haul old combines on our twin screw. We took them to Mervis and Danville to smash them up. If I had my own semi, I'd have a blue and red one. The hood would be blue, the fenders and the sides would be red. I'd put antifreeze in it because it eats ice up. I'll tell you, I'll have oil in the engine so the rod won't pop. I'll have a carburetor on the motor with 3 bolts and a red hose from the carburetor to the gas tank. You might see me in it in 2 more years because I'll be growed up and gone. I'll move to California because I got relations out there, Uncle Bert and Grandma Pete, and I know about California. It's always warm there. I wouldn't want to drive through the desert, though. The desert can bite you. Deserts can eat people. That's flat all I know. And 6-year-old Jane was in a class of emotionally disturbed kids whom I asked to draw a picture of a really unusual house with unusual people living in it. That's all I asked, and I would then go around and either write down or sometimes I would take a recorder and record what they said. And this was Jane's simple but eloquent description of the house that she drew. A ghost and a woman live together in my house. The ghost sleeps in the circle bed. The woman sleeps in the window. She dreams about ghosts, and the ghost dreams about women. When I asked 10-year-old Richard to describe what he would be if he could, be anyone other than himself, and who would he be? And tell me about that. And this was what Richard came up with. If I could be any other person, I'd be Jesus and be nice to everybody. I'd write down everybody's sins in a big brown book. I'd write them down with a red pen that will last forever. I'd keep the book in a safe in my house. Only I could open the safe. Nobody knows where I live, so nobody can open it. My house would be at the end of a straight path in the sky. Only the Lord would know the way to my house. My house would be rock with nice furniture, a white chair that I could read a book about me in, and what I did. A red rock couch and a white plastic waterbed. The water would cool me off at night. I'd live alone in my house, but I'd never get lonely because people would pray to me. And one day, I'd come down from heaven in a parachute. I'd be a real cool man. I'd give everybody their last words, and I'd say goodbye and tell them to have a nice trip. The people would take my words and say them to everybody they know. And, this was somebody who didn't have writing ability and yet profoundly understood the power of both the written and the spoken word. Once again, I was in love with the told story. And about this time, I discovered the exciting work of somebody who's still my friend, folklorist and filmmaker Bruce Jackson, who had collected the lore of prisoners, did a film on death row inmates in Texas. And while in Indiana, I worked with a group of writers to organize a book drive, and we filled the shelves at the library at Michigan City Prison. And we also had a journal that did a special issue on prison writing as well. I don't know if it was because of that or just I said the right words, but when I went to ask the head of education at the women's prison in Indianapolis, which was, interestingly, the first exclusively women's prison to be created in the United States, and started my field work there, he said, sure, you can come in. I said, I just want to ask volunteers who are willing to have their stories recorded, come and meet with me. He said, no problem. Many of the women I interviewed needed no questions to prime their memories. They told their stories as if they had been rehearsed. The stories I loved most were the stories of women who described themselves as kids who would as girls who would be more comfortable playing with the guys, skipping school, hanging out with the warehouse derelicts, than doing what they called girls' play. Theirs were the often comical, picaresque tales of a rascal making her way through life more by her wits than her industry. Women like Anna May, who as a teenager took care of her sickly Aunt Mabel, recovering from the removal of one lung. And this Aunt Mabel had right in the little table right next to her bed, had a glass jar that included the ribs that the surgeon had removed for her, from her when he removed her lungs, as if they needed to be really close to her. Anna May also told about helping out Uncle Russell at the filling station. Uncle Russell had, as a kid, broken his hip in a fall from a second-story window. And this is how Anna May described it. His mother tried to grab him by the clothes, but when she saw it was going to drag her out of the window, she let him loose. The first time Anna May was arrested was in her 20s, when drunk and angry, she busted up the front hood of her lover's Chevy. She told me that about her musical career with the Moonlight Horizons. And this was a country and western group that performed throughout Indiana and Ohio. She said they wore white crepe outfits with purple and orange lace, really stunning, she said, or she implicated. The story of Anna May's life was a litany of violent episodes. In some, she was the aggressor, in some, the unfortunate victim. As she told it, "I been had 3 men and got a 4th now I'm not married to, and all my guitars they tore up." I would go on to earn a Ph.D. in English with a special concentration in folklore, and to accept my first tenure-track job at the U.S. Naval Academy. Like the prison, the Service Academy was a closed institution with rich folklore and folk traditions that scholars had neglected or never had exposure to. I went on to write about the ways in which tradition can offer a safe place of expressing disdain for superior, can distinguish outsiders from insiders, and at its most misogynistic, can inhibit the assimilation of women into the ranks. I embedded much later in recent wars with the US Army in the Iraq War, and then a couple of years later for 10 months with 2 combat units in Afghanistan. In both instances, I listened to the stories soldiers told about previous deployments. One Marine who had served some hard time on previous deployments in both Iraq and Afghanistan told stories that expressed his fondness for the locals he'd encountered. One of the colorful characters he described was affectionately called Tooth, because he appeared to have only one tooth in his mouth, holding on to it as if a survivor's medal. Tooth, the groundskeeper at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, loved all Marines. And those who worked at the embassy were very fond of him as well. They'd give him an extra rank pin, give him a challenge coin, and he sported them all. He had them all displayed on him. And Tooth would holler when he saw a Marine, "Hey, jarhead, hello, devil dog." And one day this Marine said, he was alone with Tooth, and he said, "Hey, Tooth, how old are you?" The man didn't know. "Were you ever a soldier?" he asked. "Of course," said Tooth. "Did you fight the Russians?" said the Marine. Tooth dropped the lighthearted demeanor and looked seriously at the Marine and said, Yes. Did you kill some Ruskies? He asked. Tooth paused, then answered, I've killed more Russians than cancer. Not only had Tooth fought the Russians, he had also resisted the Taliban in its takeover when it took over in the late 1990s in Afghanistan. And because of his resistance of the Taliban, they came to his house, they killed every member of his family in front of him, 3 generations, and they were torturing him, and he would have been killed had it not been for a small unit of Marines who came and rescued him. I have learned that when people share accounts of their lives, they give the past shape and meaning. I've learned that storytelling is a collaborative act, that it requires the engagement of both teller and listener to work. I have learned that although stories can reveal, they can also conceal. I've learned that although not all stories are true, they all carry some meaning for their tellers. I have learned that some experiences rest on the other side of language in disconnected images that need time or a willing listener to coalesce into narrative. I have learned, when confronted with my own case of PTSD, that a story can heal and put to sleep the ghosts of the past. Most importantly, I have learned that stories are gifts that must be respected. The hundreds of stories I've collected, from those reflecting on a long life, often a well-lived life, from those young kids with more imagination than memory, from those whose lives have been plagued with instability, and from those we send into harm's way. These stories have enriched my life and allow me to glimpse something personal, something precious, often something profound about the person sitting across from me. My final words to you are in the form of a request that you find that friend or family member whose stories you want to discover or save. Ask if you might collect a couple of stories about this person's life. Find a quiet place. Plan to spend about an hour. Move from simple biographical questions to finally questions that invite more reflection, that are more complex. And just turn on your cell phone to recorder and record these. Be active, attentive, empathetic, and finally richer for the gift that this person will bestow upon you. The simple connection that narrative affords. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you very much. We have a good amount of time for question and answer, so if anybody has anything they would like to ask Professor Burke, please raise your hand and we'll pass you the mic.
Thank you, Carol.
This is the all-time great interviewer here. He works at
KUCI 88.9 FM. You talked about your book of poems. It was your first book. Can you just describe that? And it seems like it was appropriate that that was your first book.
Well, I guess I've had a trajectory. The first book of poems was obviously where they were, it was poetry, it was first person. The book that I'm completing now, which will be my 7th, is first person too. And so it's kind of these bookends, and although I find it more difficult to describe my stories as opposed to somebody else's stories, these were things that I wrote, and probably had I gotten a good tenure track job, I wouldn't have taken the road that I took. And I would continue to be writing poetry and teaching creative writing. But that didn't happen. And it was, it was a kind of, I look back on almost everything I've done and you think, oh no, I didn't say that, did I? And it's kind of juvenilia. It was, I did it in my 20s, and it sounds like that.
Tell us something of India.
Oh, okay. Well, I went to India. I was on a Fulbright. I was doing 5 months of research there from the beginning of August till the end of December. And because I work on militaries, my hunch was that in the area of counterinsurgency, and our 2 last wars after the first 100 days or a couple of months in Iraq and Afghanistan, when our military has toppled the regime, we're really good at that. We're not so good at building a nation afterwards. And because it lands you in the middle of a counterinsurgency, which we have been involved in now, we're still involved in to a certain extent in Iraq, but certainly in Afghanistan. And my hunch was that I could learn something from the Indian Army and the way in which they have engaged in counterinsurgencies and the way in which they understand so much more about the culture, because most of these insurgencies that they're countering happen within their own country. And I was proven right. I gathered so much information about the way they go about it that's quite different from the way that our troops do. And, but obviously while there, you can't be in India today without being confronted with the turbulence that's going on. And I tried, 2 days after I got there, the Kashmir exclusion was lifted. And then in South Delhi, where I was, there were demonstrations before I left against this new crazy citizenship rule that excludes Muslims. And it was they turned off the government turned off our Wi-Fi in southern Delhi, and it was a really interesting but a kind of crazy time to be in India too. And but it was I'll be going back. They've asked me to come back and do some work with the Indian Army as well. And so there, I still have things to learn. And I'm at the early stages. One of the interesting things about my trip, my proposal for the Fulbright, I wrote about some of the stories that I knew about the Indian Army and had read about or heard about. And one was of this character who was an officer. He was in up in Nagaland in the Northeast. He was when he was young in his career, he was just a captain, was in a very tough situation. There were no hospitals, no way to medevac him out. He had gone over mine, injured the bottom half of his leg. He cut off his own leg to save himself. And who would show up at one of the talks I was at? But Ian, this now general. And we became fast friends, and that was just one of those serendipity kinds of things that was really pleasant to happen. Yes.
Really appreciate the storytelling, and the story of Tooth really rings home of why we should all do what you ask us to do, to ask people for their stories. So I'm wondering if you have a recommendation for I mean, you're a scholar, obviously, and this is what you do for your living, but most people that you might be telling this to are not. So what do you suggest that people do with stories if they record them, that they find compelling? You know, I know that the NPR someplace has a repository, is it called this? Yeah, where you can...
StoryCorps.
Yeah. Right. So I'm just,
is probably the easiest one. They were just up in Santa Monica. And that's an easy way. Two people go together and one is the questioner, the other is the respondent. And I think that it's always good to do more than one different version of a story, i.e., one a recorded one, and then one you transcribe. And I have students do this all the time, I never recommend that I know people in the social sciences will cringe when I say this, but that you transcribe the whole interview. Find the part of it, and it might only be a paragraph long, or it might be a paragraph here and a paragraph here, that is the narrative. And when I'm teaching this in terms of ethnographic skills, I teach students to say, okay, when you're out interviewing someone and you've been doing it, you've been going for 45 minutes or an hour, and someone says, oh, let me tell you about, you just shut up, because a story is going to come. There are cues, and the more you do it, the more you recognize those. If anybody wants my tips on doing interviews, I'm happy to share them with you. Just email me, cburke@uci.edu, and I'm happy to send them to you. It's a good way of getting started. I've helped with a number of projects. I used to go around the country doing, often for libraries or little county historical societies, how do you do your own oral history family folklore project, and doing workshops, a day-long workshop for them to get them started, giving them the permission forms, all of that. But the most important thing is to do it. Even if it's, messy, you don't feel confident in doing it, just do it. Yeah.
When you're, you look at a sea of people, right? And you decide, I want to hear from you. What is that feeling like? Is that like a sixth sense, like a spidey sense? How does that strike you? Do you know what I mean? Physically, does it hit you physically?
Well, I mean, in any community, there are active and passive bearers of tradition. In any family, there are these as well. You know who the good storytellers are in your family. But often what you find is, and sometimes they're often males. And what I would find in going to households in rural Indiana, sitting down at the kitchen table, I'd be interviewing because somebody had said, oh, you need to talk to Joe Blake. So I'd go and I make an appointment, I'd sit down with Joe Blake, and Joe Blake's wife was making coffee in the background, and she would be correcting every other sentence that he said. And so finally I'd say, hey, why don't you sit down too, and we'll interview both of you. And actually getting both of them was able to get the whole story together. And that happens. But some people are the stealth storytellers. And so you have to be willing to, they're not the extroverts. You have to be willing to sit down and say, I think you've probably had an interesting life, and can you tell me about this? And I found people who would get off track. You learn ways of getting them back on track. And I've never found people who weren't interesting to interview. And I think that's part of it too. Being willing to accept what they have to tell you. And the more your willingness, and you can communicate that willingness, the more they will give you.
Yeah, I have a question. On the dimensions of performing a story versus having a story. You have thoughts for us about that, because I think very quickly people will gravitate to someone who's entertaining. And even if the story isn't much of a story, we think they're a great storyteller.
Right,
Can you
right.
give us some thoughts on what you think about those
Yeah.
two parts?
The nice thing about storytelling and oral stories as opposed to written stories is that they morph from one version into another. And I tell my students, any folklore you get, any oral communication you get of tradition is going to be meaningful to today, otherwise it would have died out. And it's going to say something, whether it's a legend, it's going to speak to an anxiety today. But one, Jack Sipes, who writes a lot about folktales and oral Appalachian folklore, has done a book on looking at just one of these wonderful storytellers. I've actually heard him tell lots of stories in person. And what he did was he followed him as this guy told the same Jack tale to an audience of children, and then an audience of teachers, and then in a bar. These were 3 different stories. We call them, folklorists, we call them all variants. They're all good. But they will change based on the audience and what protocols and expectations there are. But we do have this notion of the raconteur, and they have a big repertoire often, and they're good performers. And my father was one of those. But there were other people in the family who weren't the performers, but were my grandmother, but were every bit as good a storyteller. And so the point is not to miss those, the silent ones, the stealth storytellers.
So you left off your story at the Naval Academy, and now you're here. Can you fill in a little bit of your story in that
Okay.
gap?
Sure. I was tenured at the Naval Academy, and then and they were very good to me. They, interestingly, gave me a lot of research money and supported that. I was always hesitant to write about some of the more scandalous aspects of the kinds of things that I was gathering, the misogyny particularly. And I left the academy. I got a job at Johns Hopkins University, and within the first month I was there, I had sent something to the New Republic, and they'd agreed to publish it. They sent it to Congress, and Pat Schroeder was in Congress. They sent it to her, and she immediately went to the Secretary of the Navy and said, if what Burke says is true, now we know where Tailhook came from. And I was glad that I was in a research university, and because I got all of this flack and threats, everything, and what one day the president of Hopkins was away, so the provost was in charge, and the provost called me, and he said, I've just gotten a call from the Secretary of the Navy, and they say that you won't go over there and answer their questions. And I said, no, Joe, what I said was, you fax me any questions, I will answer them, but you're not getting the names of the people, my sources. And so what he said to me was, don't you realize that Johns Hopkins University gets its biggest research grant from the US Navy? And, at their, I suddenly thought, oh no, I thought I was out of hot water and I'm in hot water. But fortunately, there was this great libertarian, old crusty lawyer at Hopkins, and he said, this will not happen to you. And I'm going to just put out this fire right now. And it was fine after that. And I basically said to the provost, you better read the article before you make me go there and answer their questions. And because it was full of a lot of these very misogynistic marching chants. And some of them that the Naval Academy Male Glee Club, they wouldn't sing in public, but they would sing on the bus ride home. And so, you know, and I wasn't going to sell out some little midshipman who was part of the Glee Club who thought, you know, I needed to know these things.
You spend all your time collecting
Yeah.
words, Carol, but I'm wondering if you're ever tempted or you see the wisdom of combining it with objects. For example, family stories really should go along with family
Right.
photographs, or the
That's
story about the teacup
Yes.
that was brought over from Dublin or wherever.
Yes, exactly. And to a certain extent, I have a daughter who's finishing up her Ph.D. at UCLA, and she's now doing her dissertation on, it's in the business school, but it's on heritage and notions of wealth that comes with heritage. And it actually starts with a story on the teacups that were my mother's that I gave her. And so I'm leaving it to the next generation, but I think you're absolutely right. And anytime you're out collecting and you say, oh, do you have some photographs, or do you have some objects? That is a way of sort of allowing the person to tell the story around those objects. And you're absolutely right. It really works.
Unfortunately,
We got one more. Is that okay?
Yeah, let's try to sneak one more in.
There are so many genealogy type websites now that are readily available. Are there any kind of environments that we could use to capture stories of different generations with these photographs and so forth? You know, to, I don't know, have a place where my father was on this website and then go capture his stories and post them there. And then maybe he could tell stories of his father or something. Do you know of anything, or would you create one?
Well, I would love to create one, because I do, you know, I teach, I've taught a course in our literary journalism, also on the sound story and how to do sound editing and put together a story. But it would be absolutely perfect on one of these sites. And there are StoryCorps and storytelling sites, but there's also the Folklife Center at the Library of Congress does these collecting projects. Anyone who's collected from veterans, and I was part of a group that talked about how it should be set up initially. Congress funds this project to collect the stories of veterans, and they're all saved in the Library of Congress too. So there are repositories like that. The kind of thing that you're talking about, there should be. And yes, and maybe in my retirement. Sure, thank you. Thanks, good questions.
Thank you all for coming out. Please join me in thanking you.